half of you saw this question. And now the surveys will diverge a bit. Sometimes half of you see a question, half of you see a different question. So half of you saw this question. Consider a choice between the two options listed below. Which would you prefer? A sure gain of $1,000 or a coin flip. Heads, you get 2,000. Tails, you get 0. Okay, think now which preference you might have. The other half of you got this question. In addition to everything you have now, assume that you have been given $2,000. Maybe you found it in the attic. You didn't realize you had put some money away somewhere. Maybe your bank account, you got some refund you didn't expect. Who knows? You have $2,000 you didn't expect to have. Consider a choice between the two options listed below. Which one do you prefer? A sure loss of $1,000? Or a coin flip? Comes up tails, you lose 2,000. Heads, you lose nothing. Which of these two options do you prefer? Think now, kind of which one feels better to you. Okay. You have a sense? Now let me point out to you, as some of you have already figured out, having $2,000 more than you did before and now losing $1,000, that leaves you exactly with a sure gain of $1,000. Right? Having $2,000 before and now facing a 50-50 to lose it and go back to 0, or lose nothing and be up $2,000, is the same thing as a 50-50 chance to gain 2,000 or be back at 0. These are identical choices framed differently. One is framed as gains, one is framed as losses. And when we look at the data, what did you guys actually pick? Almost all of you took the sure thing. For those who saw it, almost all of you took the sure thing in the gain frame, 93% of you. But when we went to loss frame, 2/3 of you suddenly want to gamble. It's the same situation, framed differently. Okay? Before we explain why that's happening, let me give you another example from your questionnaire, which is very closely related. Will help us understand. So in this question, you were all told, imagine you work for the CDC, maybe some of you in here have, who knows. Swine flu is expected to kill 30,000 people this year. There were some other details. 2 vaccines are available. You need to choose one. Half of you were shown the following 2 vaccines. Vaccine A will save 10,000 people. Vaccine B, 2/3 chance of saving no one, but a 1/3 chance of saving 30,000 people. Okay? Get a sense now which one you kind of prefer. Okay? 10,000 for sure, or 2/3 chance of no one and 1/3 of everyone. Okay? You have a sense. The other half of you saw the vaccines described this way. This vaccine will result in 20,000 people dying from swine flu. That's for sure. The other vaccine, 2/3 chance of 30,000 deaths, or a 1/3 chance of no deaths. Looking at this, do you want the 20,000 die for sure, or this chance of 2/3 everybody dies and 1/3 nobody dies? Right? And you can feel your preferences shifting. Unfortunately, as you read these, save 10,000 people, 20,000 people die, that's the same when you're talking about 30,000 people dying. We're focused on the people we're saving, or we're focused on the people we're not saving. Same thing down here, 2/3 chance of saving no one, 2/3 probability of 30,000 deaths. That's saving no one. And a 1/3 chance of no deaths, 1/3 chance of saving everybody. Worded differently, identical choice between 2 vaccines. But again, one is framed as gains. Here's all the saving we're doing. Here's all the dying that's going to happen. And when we think about saving versus dying, our preferences shift. You could feel it shift probably as you read this. Right? And the question is, what is going on here? Here's your data. When it was gains, 2/3 of you wanted to save everyone, the 10,000 for sure, not take the risky vaccine. When it was put in terms of deaths, now almost 2/3 of you want to take the risky vaccine. This is a typical result. All the results I've shown you and will show you today are typical results.
Is it clear that it's the same straight switch of 30 people, or did some people flip-flop?
These are different people. You only saw one version.
Oh, I see.
You only get to see one version. This is what we call a between subjects design. If we put them next to each other and let you compare, for a while you'd be weirded out, but eventually you decide, okay, I'm going with this answer, and you'll probably do the same in both, right? Because you'd recognize it the same. So. There's something called reference points here. Okay? There's a difference between the problems, both the gamble problem and the vaccine problem. That's basically boils down to a difference in what we'll call a reference point. Okay? In the first version, the reference point was 30,000 deaths. Everybody saved was thought of as a gain from everybody from 30,000 deaths. The second one, the implicit reference point was nobody's dying, and compared to that, how many people die if you make each choice? And so it was implicitly thought about as everybody as losses from this reference point. We started with a low reference point and had gains, or a high reference point and had losses. Okay? Why does this matter? You guys have taken some economics by now, I'm guessing? And you've seen a concave function, often referred to in your work as utility function, right? And you have done the two-finger exercise to see why risk aversion comes from concavity, I hope. No? Let me take you through it quickly. Fine. Imagine you're sitting here, you're thinking about a Shure 10. You get this kind of utility from it. 3 plus utils, we'll call them, right? Units of satisfaction, happiness, whatever. But you have a 50, you could swap that for a 50-50 chance to be at 20 or at 0, right? That'd be sort of like a fair gamble, like the coin toss in the first question. And the question is, what are the utility consequences of that? Well, going from 10 up to 20 gets you a little bit of utility. You get about 2 units here, but the curve is flattening out, so you're not getting nearly as much as you get if you happen to go from 10 down to 0, if you lose the gamble, right? You're going to lose over 3 units, right? So you have a chance to gain 2 or lose more than 3. You don't want that, right? That's the essence of risk aversion, right? Risk aversion comes from the curvature of the utility function, in some sense. You want to think of diminishing marginal utility as primary, then risk aversion is just a consequence. It's a direct mathematical consequence of a concave function. Because it's getting flatter, moving to the right is not as important as moving to the left would be, because the left is steeper, and so you don't want to take fair gambles. So you become risk averse. And the closer you are to 0, the more risk averse you become. The more your risk is becoming ruinous versus a risk out here between small amounts where you're still rich no matter what is much less risk aversion normatively. Right? This is a theory of shoulds. It's not a theory of what does happen, but it's a theory of shoulds. Okay, this is economic theory. This is utility function. That's a nice description of risk aversion. It's not a real description of behavior. The utility function is written on something called final states of wealth. Right? You sort of take everything you have if the decision goes one way, everything you would have if the decision goes the other way, and say, which of these gives me more utility? And you take that thing. But of course, there's a sense in which that's silly. You walk into Starbucks, and you ask yourself, do I want to pay $3.75 for my double caramel macchiato? And you don't think to yourself, well, let me take my total wealth, my IRA just go up a little, minus $3.75 plus a caramel macchiato. What's my utility of that state? Or I could have this other state where I keep my current wealth, but I have no macchiato. Which has higher utility? Okay? In some sense, that's what this is asking you to do. Right? So that's not a description of behavior, but it is a normative theory of decisions. This is economic theory. Okay? A psychologist came along and said, well, how do you really think about the Starbucks case? You think about, do I want to give up $3.75 and get a caramel macchiato? What's more important to me, the $3.75 I'm paying or the caramel macchiato? I mean, you can include calories and other considerations, whatever. Right? But you think about what you're giving and what you're getting in that transaction. Once you're allowed to give stuff up, you can't represent that here anymore. This is all final states of wealth. These are all positive departures, if you will, from 0. But now you have give stuff up. You need a loss function. You need to talk about what does it mean to give up $3.75 to get a caramel macchiato. And you introduce the idea of measuring gains, but also losses, which is a very natural way we think about things, right? When you write down these analyses you did even of the Carter racing case, you start talking about the gains and the losses. Right? It's a natural human parsing of a situation. But once you have gains and losses, you have to ask, well, what am I measuring from? And it turns out what you measure from is very important. Why is it very important? Because we do have this diminishing sensitivity for gains, as utility theory prescribes, but we also have diminishing sensitivity to losses. Right? You go to Foxwoods and you lose $1,000, you feel kind of bad about that. But the truth is, you go and lose another $1,000, you don't feel twice as bad. You feel worse, but not twice as bad. It starts to level off also. Right? But if you can get back, that's why people, when they're down $1,000, tend to take a lot of risks, because getting back to 0, wow, that's the steep part of the function. Now it'd feel nice to get back up there. And going down just isn't that big a deal. And so people start escalating their risks, and this happens all the time in casinos. It's wonderfully beneficial for casinos which have a negative expected value. So they're going to make money the more you gamble. But this diminishing sensitivity and losses, notice, is not the concavity. When I do the same two-finger exercise down here, I won't go through it with you, but if I do, it basically says I want to take gambles. Because now taking gambles allows me a chance of being on the shallow part, and that's no big deal if it feels bad. But boy, if it turns out well, I get to go up the steep part, and that's great. So now for exactly the same reasons, I want to gamble when there's convexity. Right? Those of you math people, second derivative is positive, I want to take risks. When the second derivative is negative, I don't want to take risks. That just comes out of putting your two fingers on there and thinking what would happen. So now when you frame a problem with a different reference point, and it happens to land in the loss function instead of the gain function, as we did with the gamble and the vaccines, you become risk-seeking when it's a loss, risk-averse when it's a gain. The same exact situation framed from a different reference point. Okay? Let me take you through the vaccine and how that happened. Before I do that, let me tell you what I'm talking about. This is something called prospect theory, right, which you may have heard of, and you certainly will hear of again in here. It's a theory of decisions written by a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for writing this theory. But it's a psychological descriptive theory of behavior, not a normative theory of behavior. And it has several aspects, which I'll just reiterate. I went over them all. Outcomes are defined now with respect to a reference point, dividing the world into gains and losses, diminishing sensitivity away from that reference point in both directions. That implies concavity and gains, which is means risk aversion, convexity and losses, risk seeking. And there's one more aspect, which I'll get to in a little while, called loss aversion. So one more aspect of this function, just to note while it's up here, losing $10 hurts about twice as much as winning $10 feels good. Okay? Losing $10 hurts about twice as much as winning $10. So the same loss compared to the same gain is more impactful in our choices. Okay? We don't like losses. About twice as much, 2 to 2.5 times as much, depending on the situation. It's a very robust phenomenon. We'll come back to that. Okay, so let's think about the vaccine example now. In one case, we were in the gain frame, the one that was on the top half of the screen. Talked about lives saved. You could save 10,000 lives for sure. You could take a chance to save 30,000 lives. You can see how that's not that attractive a gamble. I can save 10,000 for sure. That gets me most of my value, my subjective psychological value. If I save more lives, I'm on the flatter part of the curve. It doesn't feel like that much more. And so I'm not going to take this risk of going down the steep part to 0 when I'm in the gain frame. Okay? If I'm doing the same thing from the loss frame, where now the reference point is everybody lives, and each person who dies is considered a loss from a reference point. My reference point is everybody lives. Now I could lose 20,000 people for sure. Well, that's a bad outcome. Do I want to take the gamble? Well, the gamble gives me a chance to get back up to 0, up the steep part, or go a little further down the shallower part. Okay, I think I'll take that. And so here, 2/3 of you want to gamble, and here, 2/3 of you want the sure thing. Right? It's just reframing, literally reframing the problem. Right? The way a problem is framed determines many things about how we think about it. One is our risk preferences. We like to take risks and losses. We don't like to take risks and gains. But what is a loss and what is a gain can be an arbitrary result of how you frame the problem and what reference point you adopt. Okay? A couple of real-world examples where people really do take risks and losses and not risks and gains. And if anyone has traded in here, and I have, you feel this, something called the disposition effect, which has been noted by finance researchers. Look at your stocks that sit in your brokerage account for a long time. I guarantee you those are mostly stocks below your buying price. The stocks that went up for your buying price, you sold those and locked in those gains. Right? Risk averse in gains, let's lock that in. In losses, let's ride, baby, ride. Let's just see where it goes. Right? I don't want to sell that. I don't want to realize that loss. I want to continue to take risk on that. Even if it's a bad company and I've learned it's bad, it's hard to sell. A good company, even though it's going up and I feel it's a good company, I want to sell it. You end up selling the good stocks and keeping the bad ones. Right? Precisely because you don't want to take risks and gains. And this is a very well documented effect in real brokerage accounts with real money. And it's certainly true in my account. I still have three stocks I have left. I gave up trading years ago, but I still have 3 stocks sitting there worth basically nothing because I never wanted to sell them. Also works with employee stock options, same idea. Their salient reference point often is the 52-week high and low. When things get around a 52-week high, there tends to be a lot of exercising of options. Things are around a 52-week low, there tends to be very little exercising of options. Right? Even though, interestingly, some research has shown that the stock market has a momentum in the long term. So if something's headed down, chances are it's going to keep heading down. If it's headed up in the long term, it tends to keep. But that aside, they document these 2 consequences. So we tend to value changes relative to a reference point rather than absolute levels. This is rooted in psychophysics. This is just how our perceptual system works. Some doctors in here, you know the way the nervous system is wired. If the environment stops changing, you stop getting signals. All of the signals in your nervous system pretty much are sensitive to change. If we, for example, paralyze your eye and don't let it move anymore, you'll slowly go dark. You'll stop getting signals from your retina because your retina won't see any changes. And so your eye is having these saccades all the time, to keep the stimulation changing on the nerves, which keeps them firing. Right? We are literally set up to see changes. Think about how bright a light bulb is when you turn it on during the day versus at night. Right? It seems very bright at night. It doesn't seem bright at all during the day. That's a sensitivity to the relative brightness of that. Right? Our whole perceptual system has adapted when the light gets low, and the same light that comes on feels much brighter. Right? So this idea of relative, changes relative to some reference point is very deeply rooted in most of our nervous system, in fact, even in our simple senses. It also works in our higher level cognitions and our decision making for the same reasons. So let me give you an example, perceptual example. Look at the two boxes in the center of these two. Are they roughly the same darkness or brightness? This is kind of gray. This is kind of gray. So here I put four black out text boxes. I'm just going to remove them. I promise I'll do nothing but remove the four text boxes that I put around that. Removed all four. I haven't changed anything else. Those the same darkness? No.
Yes.
No, they don't look the same at all. You're wired like the rest of us. These do look the same to you. You should see a doctor. There's some in the room I could recommend. Notice, as you're seeing these two things be different now, or be the same earlier, you are not feeling, oh, well, this is dark because it's in a light background. Oh, this looks lighter because it's in a dark background. That's not our experience of it at all. Our experience is, here's a dark square, here's a light square. But of course, our eye must be taking into account what's around it for us to be seeing these things. And so we use reference points, literally physical reference points, but also in decisions, psychological reference points, like lives saved and lives lost, without knowing it. It's just part of how we read problems. It's how we think about problems. It's how we frame situations. We bring into the context some reference point, and once that reference point is there, it works on our perceptions, and we don't feel it working. We are not aware of the reference dependence of all of our perceptions and all of our choices, but it's there. Right? It's there.